first epistle of Clement, if the writer, whoever he is, he's totally convinced in his mind that the temple still exists and the temple sacrifice activity is still going on. He's writing about it in the present tense. 72 in a lunar base year, 70 in a solar base year. So the Ptolemy thing is interesting. He picked 72 elders and put them in a different chamber, and they come up with they all interpret the book is called the 70. So again, you've got 70, 72. This seemed to create a character who is crucified at the age of 30 in the 16th year of Tiberius, what we now call 30 Common Era. 40 years later, 70 years after he's born, the temple's destroyed. And this story wasn't written until after the temple was destroyed, so retrospectively. Because Paul says he saw an apparition of Jesus in the sky, doesn't mean Paul saw an apparition of Jesus in the sky, it just means he said he did, because they need Paul to exist after Jesus died and before the temple was destroyed.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant. You are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm joined by Mike Lawrence, one of the great mythicists of our time. We're going to get into some facts that sort of point to a theory you might not have heard of or might not have gotten from Carrier or Price or Fitzgerald. There's some other things that Mike Lawrence and his research has come across. And to start it off, you actually believe that there was a Jesus that predates Pontius Pilate?
Well, I believe people were worshipping a savior demigod figure, some of which, in different versions, some of which would have been given the name, the equivalent name of Jesus in their time, Jesus. And there wasn't just one, there were many, and they were mythical. But those have been eradicated through the course of time. They've been replaced with the idea of a real Jesus that we find in the Gospel of Mark. But there is evidence that there was worship of mythical type figures of the exact same genre. I think BCE, definitely before Pontius Pilate became prefect of Judea, and probably 50 to 100 years prior to that too.
Yeah, and you talk about the Clement of Rome dating. And there's like a paragraph in there that talks about it's like a very vague paragraph that they use to actually date it. And there's a reason why they date it. Do you want to get into what you think that is?
Yeah, there is, it's pretty much near the opening. So, owing, dear brethren, to the sudden calamitous events that have happened to ourselves, we have been somewhat tardy in responding to the points you questioned us. This is used for dating. They say, this is the persecutions of Domitian in 96. Now, you have to question that. If you're just looking at the text itself, he doesn't say what the calamitous event was. He doesn't even say whether it was forced on them by humans, whether it was a natural event, when it happened. There is no other information. So to turn around and say, this must have been the persecutions of Domitian, is clearly... I would say 19th century dating, looking for a reason to place that epistle in a time frame that suits the Jesus story. But when you read the other material within the document, if you read that without regard to the data in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just look at the data in the epistle, you come out with a much earlier date than that.
Yeah, and that Domitian, so that's the 96 AD. That's what they get that from. That's the year that Domitian supposedly is persecuting Christians. And I also hear there's like Carrier, for example, thinks that Domitian was just persecuting Jews, and that this was later co-opted to make it a Christian martyrdom type of theme, which kind of makes
this comes along. Yeah, this comes along with Eusebius and the church history around. When would you say this had been about early 300s?
Yeah,
to basically portray the Christian religion as always being persecuted, and the founders were martyrs. There may have been some persecution of Christians, but it's like you single that out and then portray it as this is the only type of persecution that was happening. We do know from Pliny that there was the case that some people were being, suffering capital punishment because they refused to worship the Roman gods and sacrifice at the right times. Well, that's what they're being executed for. If they happen to be Christians, it's like, oh, Christian persecution. But there would have been other people, other beliefs also possibly, refusing to worship. But we home in on one small group and then claim that persecution for all of them. That seems to be a human trait in reporting, and it happens a lot today as well.
Yeah, and it seems like it's funny because there's a double standard, because that time period they start doing the same thing towards other Christians who follow the Nicene Creed. This actually plays into this whole theory with these Gnostic Christians. Their belief of Jesus was totally allegory.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and again, it's interesting to point out that the apologists will say, well, Gnosticism come after literalist Christianity. What I call literalist Christianity would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, so post 70. And there is no evidence that that's the case. But when you look at it logically, you think, well, if you had allegorical, mythical versions of savior demigod figures, some of which are called Jesus, and then for some reason, we can come to the reason later, post 70, that was turned into a story about a supposed literal Jesus. Then further down the line, through the happenstance of battle, one emperor decides, I like that religion, we'll pick that one. Everyone now needs to follow that. Then you've got a course of events which shows Gnosticism coming first and literalist gospel type Jesus coming second. But you won't get literal, I'd say, apologetic scholars agreeing with that. Oh, no. The earliest texts we've got are from 200, 250. Well, they're the texts that we found in the Nag Hammadi library. That just means those belief systems existed in that time period when those documents were written. But it doesn't mean to say that was the start point of Gnosticism.
Right. It's not like they pulled up papyrus and wrote on them that day and then put them in
and then put it in the ground. Exactly.
That had to have taken time to get to that point.
There's history behind those documents, and there's also a reason why put the documents in a jar and hide them in the ground. You're hiding them for a reason.
For a reason, right? That's a good point. And Philo is a prime example of this. Philo is a Platonic Jew, Greek-speaking, Greek-writing Jew living in Egypt, who's writing about this sort of what seems like, when you read it from a modern eye and you look back and you're reading it, he's talking about the logos. He's talking about, God having a son and being a threefold. It sounds like Christianity. It really does.
Yeah. Christian, the Mark pulls a lot from Philo, and it's interesting that Philo would have been about 50 years old in 30 CE, and around about the time that a supposed charismatic Jew was commanding crowds of 5,000 or more to preach to, and he couldn't walk around anywhere in the Levant without being recognized. Yet Philo, who was so important a Jew that he actually headed a contingent to go and see Caesar to basically, he was asking for some leniency in some particular areas with some Jews. He was that high a Jew, but he's never heard of a person called Jesus of Nazareth who
never mentioned.
Doesn't mention Christians, Christ, Jesus, and he's a real high-ranking Jewish person alive at the time who wrote an awful lot. And as you just said, it's interesting that his thought process seems to be evident in the Gospel of Mark.
It would be like somebody who's obsessed with baseball and writing about baseball, but never mentions the Major League Baseball, never mentions the MLB. Just like just talking about like other base, like you're missing the big kahuna, the guy that's claiming to be a Messiah.
The number one, numero uno.
Even if you hated the guy, you would be like, this idiot thinks he's the Messiah. He would say something.
Yeah. Even if he utterly disagreed with what was being said, because he was supposedly making such an impact, he would have passed comment. Yes.
And then you got Pliny the Elder, the same thing. He's writing about the same topics. He's writing about prodigal births. He's writing about deified people. He's writing about Jews and Qumran. He's writing about all these subjects and just forgets that there's a guy there who's leading this huge cult, like you said, 5,000 people. I mean, you would think one person would have got to him when he wrote his natural history, but they didn't. So that tells you right there, if you're looking at this from like a perspective of like a, you're analyzing this like a detective, you would be like, okay, so he couldn't have been there during that time period. This has to be later. And then you're like, okay, if it's later, then that means that the historical person couldn't be there either. So they're writing back. This is all backdating. This is all made up. That's what the conclusion I get to. And it's funny because then you look at Paul's letters, because Paul and Clement's letters, or I should say just Paul's letters, for example, he's supposedly writing in the 50s. He's supposedly writing before the Gospels get written, but he doesn't know anything about those narratives.
Exactly, yeah. I actually get quite a bit of a bashing for this. You said supposedly writing in 50s. I will agree he's definitely writing before the Gospels were written, that the Gospel of Mark, because they're post-70. The dating of Paul for writing in the 50s comes basically from Acts. Well, Paul didn't write Acts. Paul's dead when Acts was written, and Acts was written just to bring Paul into the gospel narrative. There is another reason for Acts as well, which it softens the message. We can come to that later. But if it wasn't for that mention of Paul standing in front of Gallio when he was in Achaia, and then finding plaques that mentioned Gallio and when he was governor of Achaia, you wouldn't be able to date Paul to 50 from Paul's letters, the 7 authenticated letters of Paul. When you look at those from first word to last word, all 7 of them, there is only one item in them that you can use to date the letters at one historical person. And there is nothing in there that would allow you to date them to 50. I know a lot of people disagree with me here, but I think his mention of King Aratus in Damascus is King Aratus III, who lost sovereignty of Damascus in 72 BCE. Because King Aratus IV, who that is attributed to, never held sway in Damascus at all. And the interesting thing is that at the time that this is supposed to have happened, I escaped Damascus while I can't remember the actual word. The governor of King Aratus was searching for me to kill me. At that particular time, for that to be Aratus IV, we've got to look at when this would have taken place. It's a case of just prior to Tiberius dying, Rome was on a war footing with the Nabateans, who he was the king of, to the point where Tiberius had ordered the Syrian legions to march down, intercept King Aratus, defeat the Nabateans, and kill Aratus. So you're on a war footing there. And then that never actually happens because Tiberius dies before the action is carried out. The legions are on their way down to Jerusalem. Tiberius dies. Caligula becomes the emperor. But 3 years later, Aratus IV died. So there is only a 3-year period where King Aratus IV could have had any influence over a Roman city, Damascus, in his lifetime. And there is nothing in the record that suggests that is the case. Some historians say, Caligula must have given Aratus IV some sort of sovereignty over Damascus for a short while. And the only reason they say that is because of, I think it's 1 Corinthians, because of Paul's mention of trying to escape King Aratus from Damascus. Other than that, there's no reason to attribute it to Aratus IV. But if you then say, well, he's talking about Aratus III, then he's in Damascus in 72 BCE. And if he's writing his letters sort of 16, 17 years later, we're into the 60s, 50s BCE that Paul is writing letters about a savior called Jesus, who died and resurrected for our sins. And it's important to note that that's all Paul says about Jesus. Yeah, so that's all he says about Jesus. And it's interesting that this Jesus in Paul's letters doesn't say anything to anyone. He gives 2 snippets of verbal information to Paul by way of an apparition. And so Paul is seeing Jesus in the sky. And it's important to note out that because Paul says he saw an apparition of Jesus in the sky, doesn't mean Paul saw an apparition of Jesus in the sky. It just means he said he did because he's attention seeking. So it must have been a big thing back then. Oh, I've seen Jesus. He said something to me in the sky. So he gives him two snippets of information. One is the Eucharist, and that's expanded on. But that's all he says. And the other interesting thing is when you come to the message, the teachings, Paul never attributes anything that he tells his followers to do to Jesus. He takes the credit for it. If I tell you to be good to other people, turn the other cheek, the old maxim, do as you would be done by, and things like this. Paul is saying this is his teaching. He doesn't say, oh, don't forget Jesus when he preached to the 5,000 people said we must X, Y, Z. He doesn't give this Jesus character any credit at all. It's as though, as you say, to him, this Jesus character doesn't exist. Yeah, he is a mythical God.
Yeah, and you know what's fascinating is, first of all, the Talmud Jesus, the historical Talmud Jesus, dates to what you're talking about, which is very interesting. I wonder if that's the one. I wonder if there is a historical Jesus. I wonder maybe if that's the guy, because the Talmud actually dates to in the 1st century BC, not AD. A lot of people don't know that. Yeah. But regardless of that, the Paul's letters. Now, that's an interesting theory that you think that it's in the 1st century BC, but it also lets you. The reason why it could be true is what I'm saying. What I'm getting at is he never mentions any of the characters. Never mentions Mary. Never mentions Joseph. Never mentions any of the disciples. Never mentions Pontius Pilate. Never mentions any narratives. No Judas Iscariot. Nothing. He only talks about this sort of heavenly, allegorical. Yeah. Died and resurrected for our sins, and that's it. That's all you get. Yeah. There's no connection. There's no relation to the two texts at all.
Yes, exactly. So there is no Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Paul's letters, but there is content of Paul's letters in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that kind of tells you the order. Well, we know that order anyway, but then when you start looking at that, well, what is the time? What is the time gap? Why does it have to be 50? Well, for the church, it has to be 50 because they need Paul to exist after Jesus died and before the temple was destroyed. Hey, right. 50. Wow. They have to have Paul existing then. Yeah, if you look at it and date it critically, which apologists will never do, you think, well, there's no evidence that he was preaching this in 50 Common Era, none whatsoever. The only evidence for that comes from Acts. And isn't it interesting that when you come to the Damascus event, in Paul's letters, he says it was the ethnarch, I've just remembered the word, the ethnarch of King Aratus was searching for me to kill me. But when you get to that event being portrayed in the Gospels, they say it was the Jews that were searching for me and I had to escape the city. They completely eradicate Aratus from the scene and they shorten the scene. So they saw the scene as kind of important, so they included it, but they also saw it as slightly problematic in the way Paul was wording it. Well, they thought that for a reason, obviously. So they've adapted it, and it's not. It doesn't create that conflict when you read it in the Gospels, but that conflict is there in Paul's letters.
Yeah, and then in the Book of Acts, a lot of those historical events that happen in there, you would think there would be evidence of. For example, Paul appealing to Caesar and going in front of Agrippa. That sounds like a historical event that we can find. You can't find that anywhere.
No.
Only
But So his Greek name is Paul. He was a Roman citizen. He comes from Tarsus. All in Acts. None of that is in Paul's letters. So why would we then say, well, let's just take that from Acts, plonk it onto Paul's letters, and read them in that light? Well, you shouldn't do that. You should just read what Paul's written.
Yeah. And so now we got to get to, you talked about it has to be 50 and Jesus has to be born in the year. We now think the year 1 is based off birth of Jesus, but there's a number, the number 70/72 that plays a big role in this. What do you talk about that? And I'll
I mean, this is where I have to point out, I do not believe this myself. I'm just highlighting the fact that the ancients did.
Of course.
And therefore they wrote about it. So there is a small set of astrological numbers that you can derive by simple naked eye stargazing. And it would seem that separate civilizations from history did the same thing and come up with the same numbers. And when you think about it, back then there's no TV. The only thing to do at night time is to look up the sky and wonder. So you've got the number 7 is a really big special number, and that's just basically the 7 visible heavenly bodies. So that's Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Moon, the
Sun, and Mercury.
And Mercury. Yeah. So they're the 7 heavenly bodies that you can see with a naked eye. That's where they come up with 7. And you could think anyone looking at the sky and wondering would come up with that number, because there are 5 stars that are not fixed in the firmament. So the firmament shifts across the sky in unison every night, but there are 5 particular stars that appear in different places each night and sometimes disappear completely. They're wandering stars. So add those 5 to the sun and the moon, we get 7. 360 was the first best guess at a lunar year, so or a lunar or solar year. It was their first best guess, and we know that the earliest calendars only had 360 days. And we know from the Hebrew text that a time was 360 days. So when they say like a time or a time and a half, they're talking about lots of 360. So they venerated the number 360. 30 comes about by basically taking 12. So 12 times 30 is 360. So there are 12 lunar moons in a lunar year, full moons in a lunar year, and 360 divided by 12 gives you the 30. So that's that set of numbers. But then there were 2 interchangeable, really special numbers. So there was a big thing about where the sun rises on the vernal equinox, on the Easter equinox, and it rises into a star sign. Now, clearly you can't see it, it's daytime, but it does rise into a star sign. And that gives us what we call an age, an astrological age. So when that sun rised in Taurus, that was the age of Taurus, then the age of Aries, then the age of Pisces, the start of the Jesus age. The next age will be the age of Aquarius. Well, that changes because the firmament on the horizon isn't fixed. It actually shifts each year by a minute amount, and it's so small that it shifts by 70 or 1 degree of the 360 degrees, 70 to 72 years. So you can't see it, but over time you would notice it.
Seneca and Manetho both wrote about this. So if anyone's wondering where we got this from, these are ancient historians were talking about this, and this was household stuff. But go ahead.
Yeah. So 70/72, depending on which basically which part of the world you come from, become venerated as a great day. So it was 1 degree. 30 degrees took, I think it was 2,500 years or whatever. That's the end of a great year, and it's the end of one epoch and the start of another. Okay. So these were venerated numbers. Now, when we go back and look at 70 and 72, basically it would be 72 years in a solar base year, 70 years in a lunar base year. Got that the wrong way around. 72 in a lunar base year, 70 in a solar base year. So different cultures sort of venerated either 70 or 72. Now, come outside of Christianity and go through all the other cultures, and you can find the veneration of the number 70/72 in many other cultures prior to Christianity. A pharaoh's mummification process had to take exactly 70 days. There are other instances that I've put in my book. I can't bring them to mind at the moment. But then when we get to the Tanakh, the Hebrew Tanakh, if you read what we're calling the Old Testament now and notice how many not messianic prophecies, just prophecies are in there involving the number 70, you can see that clearly it was a big number to the Jews as well. And just one of those prophecies of 70 years is taken to mean that there will be, if you reject the Messiah when he arrives, there will be a penance to pay after 70 years. And that particular 70-year prophecy seems to be what's been taken and reinterpreted after the temple was destroyed. You can imagine that the Jews, so there were temple compliant Jews, there were temple resistant Jews, they were still Jews, but they didn't follow temple law. There were quite a few factions. They've just been slaughtered basically by the Romans, and the temple's been destroyed. And they're trying to make sense of this, and they're thinking, why has this happened? Why has God allowed this to happen? Is it that we've followed a false theology all these years, or is it that we haven't worshipped correctly? And in my view, they come up with that second answer. It's not that we've that the theology was wrong; it's that we've not been worshipping God correctly. They can see that Daniel, whoever wrote Daniel, has reinterpreted Jeremiah. So Jeremiah gave a 70-year prophecy about the destruction of Nebuchadnezzar in 586, and it says in there that your land will be desolate for 70 years. And lo and behold, in 516, they dedicate the Second Temple, exactly 70 years later, in the 6th year of Darius. Well, it wouldn't have been exactly 70 years later. It would have been during the reign of Darius, but to fit prophecy, we'll say 516, Darius. Well, whoever wrote Daniel is basically reinterpreting that passage to suit what's happening in his time frame, which is when Antiochus IV desecrates the temple. So he reinterprets that and writes the 70 times 7 passage in chapter 9 of the book of Daniel. After the temple fell in what we now call 70 Common Era, which is the 28th year of Augustus, I can't remember the actual year, but what we now call 70 Common Era, the Jews look for an answer and they reinterpret that passage again in light of what's just happened to them. They say, well, look, the temple's just been destroyed. This passage says if we don't worship God right and we reject his Messiah when he comes, the temple will be destroyed and so will Jerusalem 70 years after his advent. And wouldn't you know that if you look at the Gospels, we can come to the exact dating later, but they seem to create a character who is crucified at the age of 30 in the 16th year of Tiberius, what we now call 30 Common Era. 40 years later, 70 years after he's born, the temple's destroyed. And this story wasn't written until after the temple was destroyed, so retrospectively. And you can see that any document that's mentioning a Jesus character prior to 50 doesn't have any of this content in there. He's not a real, there's no biography, he's not a real Jesus, he's worshipped allegorically and mythically. And then suddenly, after 70, we've got 4 Gospels that have turned that mythical character into a real character, and the story seems to suggest the temple was destroyed because we were disobedient and we crucified the Messiah. And secondly, don't worry about the fact that the sacrificial altar is now gone and we have no sin forgiveness process because we have a new one. We now have a once-off sacrifice in the Lord. So they've not only answered why the temple was destroyed, they've also put in place a new sin forgiveness process. And then that launched a new version of a Jesus character, this one supposedly real.
And so that means that the entire dating of the reason why we're in the year 2021 is because of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple being, and then backdating to 70 years before that. It's mind blowing, and it actually makes sense because it has to fit that prophecy. So if you actually accept that, if you're a scholar and you accept that the dating of the temple or the destruction of the temple happened 70 years after Jesus was born, my question is, what church do you go to? Because you have to accept this is a miracle now. So that's why you make a lot of sense. And as far as the epistles not mentioning any of these narratives, which they don't, none of these narratives are in there. I heard Bart Ehrman. I love Bart Ehrman. I'm not saying anything bad about him, but I heard him once talk about, well, my mother's a Christian. She writes letters, and she doesn't ever talk about, she writes about Jesus. She never talks about what's in the Gospels. Yeah, but she's not also trying to build a church and send letters out to all these different churches in Greece. She's not trying to literally write religious documents that are supposed to be timeless. So that's not happening. And I'm sure if she wrote enough letters, she would say something like, you know what I'm saying? Like that's why I don't buy that. It sounds like a nice little write-up, but it doesn't work to me.
It's an apologetic answer, isn't it? I mean, as you say, Bartman's a great scholar, but it's an apologetic answer. In Paul's, is it Galatians? I can't remember. He actually states he traveled to Jerusalem and he spent 2 weeks with Cephas and James. Now, when you look at the narrative that he gives for the Eucharist, where Jesus comes down and says to him, you know, this is my blood, do this in remembrance of me, this is my bread, but that's all he says, there's no story. And if we hypothesize that the Jesus character was real, and that Last Supper event with the 12 people, you know, a table for 12, please, that actually happened, wouldn't you think that in that 2-week period, Paul would be so curious as to say, what actually happened on that night? How did it go down? What did Judas say? These would be burning questions in his mind. That would come out in his letters. He wouldn't just say, oh, Jesus appeared to me in the sky and said, this is my blood. And that's so, mystery religion of the time. It's unreal. Mithras has a Eucharist ritual. Plutarch tells us about other demigods that have Eucharist rituals. And all Paul has done there is given his allegorical Jesus a Eucharist ritual. And you can tell that the gospel writers have used Paul's letters and that particular passage and turned it into a full-blown scene on the ground with the dinner for 12. So
yeah, and so you got these numbers 12, 7, or 7, 12, 70. But this goes back to Ptolemy I think Ptolemy the Savior, Ptolemy Soter, or no, I'm sorry, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. He's the one that takes I think this is a made up story, but supposedly the story says that he ordered 6 people from each 12 of the 12 tribes of Israel to come to Egypt and write the Greek Bible. And it's called the 70, the Septuagint. But you also get 72 in certain versions and 70 in other versions because of what you said. And I always wonder, why is it 70 and 72?
Why is it 70? Yeah. Yeah, it's cool. Just say the Islamic world seems to follow 72. And actually, if you look at I think the difference between Greek and Latin versions of the Bible, Jesus sent out 70 apostles in some, but he sent out 72 in other versions, the difference between Greek and Latin. And you can see that people using these numbers interchangeably. So I suppose it all depends which side of the fence you fell on with the astrology as to whether you use 70 or 72 in your stories. I think it's also the same with the generations from Adam to Jesus, how many generations there were? 70 or 72. Yeah.
And then you got in Luke chapter 10, the mission of the 70 or mission of the 72. And it's always, exactly. and they go out and they're stomping on snakes' heads, and everyone's about, the demons even bow to us in your name. And it's 70. They always had to be that number, but never says any of the characters' names, just 70. You don't know who
70, I mean, when you go through the Tanakh, is 70 sons of whoever will be slain in battle this year, and your land will be desolate for 70 years. It's always 70 or 72 in
and it's a picture of the zodiac. And so everyone knows the zodiac has 12, but there's actually a larger zodiac that has like 72. I think it's 72. It's in the 70s, but it might be 72 exactly. But there's a whole plethora of constellations. But the reason why I bring that up is because in Genesis, I should say, I think it's Exodus, they're in the desert, and they come across it's called the river of Mara or something, something that starts with an M, and they describe it as being a stream with a river with 12 streams and 72 palm trees. It's literally a picture of the zodiac right in front of you, right in the text. And so here we go. If this is a historical event where we should be able to find a place with 72 palm trees with 12 streams, that should be there. It's not. There's no place in the desert that has a river with 12 streams and 72 palm trees. That is a mythological
using astrological numbers to tell the story, which is what's happened since time immemorial. Yeah, so, and we still do it today, don't we? Lucky 7, unlucky 13. It's a big thing. I have I'm pretty sure 7, 12, 30, 360, 70, 72 come from astrology. I've got a hunch about 40 because 40 is a big number, and I think it just happens to be that 40 is the gestation period for a human in hebdomons. So a hebdomond is a lot of 7 days. It takes 40 lots of that to produce a human, and you can almost, your mind can clog you. So they wandered the desert. The Jews wandered the desert for 40 years, and then they emerged. So it's almost like a gestation period for the Jewish
40
nation.
days and 40 nights. They see that a lot too.
Yeah. So that's a guess that where that come from, but it's a pretty good guess. It could be something that's saying, well, we want to link the human to the cosmos, and they do it with that number 40.
Yeah, it's that's what you get, is you get these astro-theological references throughout the text, and the numbers are always that. They're always it's never like 13, or it's never like 42 people, or like 17 people. It's always 7, 3, 12. It's always that every single time.
and Jesus could have been sort of born any number of years before the fall of the temple. Just happens to have been born 70 years before the fall of the temple, and that wasn't decided until a story was written after the temple fell. And you go, well, come on, people, let's just sort of put this in order, put it in chronological order and try and work out what's happened here.
Yeah, and I think when you look at it, like we were just talking about Ptolemy Philadelphus curating this new Greek Bible. What I think would happen after that, I think naturally. So now all of a sudden you got a new religion in Egypt with a new text. It's this mysterious Jewish religion, but they can read it in Greek. So they're going to apply their Greek philosophy to it. They're going to apply the Logos. They're going to apply the Christos as the Messiah. So what I think this is naturally leading to these new Jewish cults springing up that are anti-temple, because they're not there. Yes. So why would they want to please the temple if they're not there? So they have to make it not again. And then the laws, we don't want those laws. We don't want to circumcise ourselves. You're going to see naturally that's going to jump in there. So what I think happens is this is all natural formation. And then you got the concept of a Messiah. So they're told at the end of, I think it's Malachi, that Elijah's going to come back. So now they have to do that. They have to deal with that somehow. Okay, John the Baptist could be Elijah. Boom, that's done. That's dealt with. But then you got all these messianic prophecies, and if you're thinking about people like Ptolemy or Mithridates or whoever, like Syria, Egypt, Greece, people reading these texts that aren't Jews, what they're going to do is they're going to come up with a Messiah figure that they want.
Yes, exactly that. Their Messiah figure. So if you're preaching this idea to people in area A, they're going to interpret it, and then they're going to morph it and develop it. An area C, where they have no contact with each other, they're going to do it in a different way. You're going to come up with whole loads of different Messiah figures in that time period.
Yeah.
The Ptolemy thing is interesting. As you say, it's fiction, but they say he picked 72 elders and put them in a different chamber, and they come up with they all interpret it directly. And then, as you say, the book is called the 70. So again, you've got 70, 72. Yeah.
And it's almost like they're creating a miracle story to get people to say, here's the truth. This is it. Now and so that leads into like this whole entire Proto-Christianity, these Gnostic Jewish cults that are springing up in Egypt and Syria. And then the concept of a Messiah being like this Son of God figure, this highest of all angels. You see it in the Ascension of Isaiah. You see it in the writings of Philo. So it's not that crazy to think that this concept got taken and evolved over time into something what it is now.
And they're being morphed with the existing Egyptian Greek mystery religion version. So they're just taking the two, morphing them together, and coming up with new ideas. And we've got the savior demigod figure, being crucified in the ether. Yeah,
it becomes this universal religion, which makes sense from like when you go farther in the time in the 4th century. It makes sense from a Constantine or Theodosius standpoint to want to actually promote this religion, because this religion covers everything. This religion we have our pagan aspects. We still have our celebrations and stuff like that. We still eat the bread and drink the wine. That's all pagan. But we had this giant Jewish population. 10% of the people in Rome are Jewish. We got all of the Eastern Roman Empire. We got Egypt. We got Carthage. What's a better way to unify the empire with this Jewish religion, but it's not totally Jewish. It's actually kind of anti-Jewish. So it sort of deals with everything. It sort of covers all the boxes. It's like the perfect.
Yeah, it's a little bit for everyone. Yeah, yeah, and the Christian world wouldn't admit it today, but that's the reason that there, from Constantine onwards, is the very reason we're having these conversations now. It was brutally enforced as the religion from Constantine onwards. So Constantine's he made it a legal religion, but he did put the groundwork in place for enforcing it. His two sons followed that on, and then Theodosius, Honorius, Valentinius, they brutally enforced it, and that went on all the way through to the mid 1600s. So over 1,300 years of get my maths right, 1,600 years of brutal enforcement. That's the only reason we're having these discussions today. It's nothing to do with it was a brilliant message, people loved it, and the Pope sent out all his emissaries, and people just flocked to him. Yeah, we're all going to change to that. It was more the case that people didn't want to be burnt to death. So that you're right. We'll go with this Jesus figure you're telling us actually existed.
Yeah, and you can see the cover up basically with this old Gnostic Christianity that was in the 2nd century, or even these Jewish revolts, the Bar Kokhba revolt, revolts happening in Rome. Like it seems natural from the empire's perspective to say, but this needs to get squashed somehow. Like we need to sort of pacify these revolts keep happening. The Jews are the biggest thorn in the Roman Empire from 1st century to the 4th century. And then all of a sudden that sort of stops when Christianity becomes a state religion. I mean, that's really, so they sort of take over the whole entire concept of messianic, and that's what becomes Christianity.
Yeah, and as you say, there's a little bit in there for everybody. They've got their route to an afterlife. With all you have to do is worship Jesus. You've got your route to afterlife. The temples have got their income because they invented indulgence. Cross our palm with silver, and we'll make sure you go straight to heaven and get stuck in purgatory. And everything worked fine. And anyone that sort of upset the boat, the Gnostics, like the Albigensian Crusade, they were just brutally eradicated, and all their literature.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying, and what. Because that shows you all of the markings of like a created religion are there. But like you said, like the tithes being, we'll keep the tithes thing in there, the 10%, that's cool. But let's get rid of this, let's get rid of that, let's get rid of this, but let's add this too. And you see like the perfect religion for Rome is being just believe. And then what that does is it allows you to win over the hearts and minds of people. So if they're Christian and they're living in Carthage, and there's a revolt in Carthage, and you need an army real quick, if they're Christian and you have the bishops and the popes, they're gonna fight for you rather than fight for Carthage. They're gonna be more in line to go and die for you, which is what they want. They want people to die for them. Oh, you're gonna go right to heaven if you go fight our wars for us. Go into Gaul and just go and attack that village right there. And if you die, you're going straight to heaven. You're
going straight to heaven. You're going to die for the Lord. Yeah.
Right. And the fascinating part about all this is the farther back you go, the closer you get to the historical Jesus, the farther apart Christian sects are. You have Ebionites, you have Marcionites. They don't have no Nicene Creed. There's all these different. There's Demiurge theory. There's Sophia. And today you got Baptists, you got evangelicals, you got Catholics, and people look at that and say, there's so many different Christians right now. They're so different from each other. No, they're pretty much exactly the same in comparison to the 1st century, 2nd century Gnostic forms of Christianity.
Yeah. And it's, I put the 70-72 idea over it as a theory. I'm pretty sure that's how it panned out. But then your research goes down the line. Well, is there anything else that can actually add weight to that? And that's when we come to the first epistle of Clement, the epistle of Barnabas. The first epistle of Clement, if you actually read it void of the gospel content and just look at the content there for dating purposes, it's hard to come out with a date past temple destruction, because the writer, whoever he is, he's totally convinced in his mind that the temple still exists and the temple sacrifice activity is still going on. He's writing about it in the present tense. Now, you could argue that, well, okay, maybe he's just mistaken, but he's writing from Rome. He's writing as a Christian from Rome. If he is writing as a Christian from Rome in 96, he would know the temple has been destroyed. There's no way he would write about it in the present tense. So he seems to be writing pre-temple destruction. And you can go pre-temple destruction because in 71 Common Era, Titus was given a victory parade in Rome that went through an extravaganza. It went through the middle of the forum.
It showed off the tabernacle.
Yeah, yes, and it ended on Capitoline Hill with the sacrifice to the Roman gods of the Jewish leaders. The people in Rome post 71 would know the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed and Jerusalem had been defeated. That kind of suggests whoever the author of the first epistle of Clement was, and it wasn't Clement, was writing before that event. Equally, when you read it, there doesn't seem to be any indication of hostility between Rome and Jerusalem within the letter. That doesn't mean it was written before the war started, but it's an indication that it probably was. So you're talking 66, so written pre-66. Now, you could argue then, well, okay, we'll give you 66. It's written in 66, but that's still time for Christianity to be true. But the problem then comes with the content within the letter with regards to the longevity of the two groups in the letter. So it's being written from a Christian community in Rome to a Christian community in Corinth in Greece. And it talks about the church in Greek being ancient at the time that they write the letter. And loads of people say, oh, yeah, back then ancient could have meant 20 years. Yeah, but think about it. If you're saying 60, you only need 20 years to say, well, that's it. Christianity can't be true. Because now you've got people worshipping a Jesus figure in Greece and Rome before Pontius Pilate became governor of prefect of Judea. And it says the people that, the envoys that we send this letter to you with have been with us from birth to age. They're old, not middle-aged, they're actually old. And there is a work I referred to in the book on average ages if you get past your infancy in that time period within the Mediterranean world. And old age would have been considered to have been 40, 50. So he says, these have been with us from youth to age. These people are kind of 40 plus. They're not 25, 30-year-old youngsters.
Right.
Well, there you go. That's a generation. So if you're writing a letter before 66 and the people that are being sent with the letter are already of age and they've been with the group since they were born, you're going far too far back now for Christianity, the gospel story to be true. And the last one is, although they're quoting from the Old Testament, they say, they use as a quote, these things you said to our fathers. And, none of it has come true. You promised our fathers this, now you promised us this, and none of it has come true. It's a quote from the Old Testament, but he's quoting it for a reason. And he's quoting it because people in the group are disagreeing. Well, if you've got more than one generation, again, your fathers disagreed as well, you're disagreeing, but you shouldn't do. You should keep the faith. You're talking about two generations. So the Epistle of Clement, to me, clearly identifies Christian groups calling themselves Christian, worshipping a demigod savior called Jesus in Rome and Corinth before Pontius Pilate became prefect of Judea. And again, like Paul, in all of their letters, there is no historical Jesus. They only ever talk about the death and resurrection, and they talk about it in an allegorical sense.
Yeah.
So, it starts to tie in with the idea of 70 and 72 was they just used that number as a reason to explain why the temple had been destroyed. And then you start looking at the writings that were written before the temple was destroyed, and you find, hold on, these have been incorrectly dated. You can now see why the first epistle of Clement is dated to 96 by the Christian apologists. They need it to be dated later in order to give enough time for those groups to have formed and existed in Rome and Corinth. They can't go with the actual dating, because to do that is to admit that the gospel stories are fiction.
Yeah, and one of the fascinating things about these letters is if they're supposedly written in a time when we're supposed, like reading Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius, there's brutal war going on during those times, and they're not talking about anything happening. They're not talking about, yeah, down the street from me, this place is on fire, my friend died the other day. That should be like front and center in these letters, but they're not. They're talking, it seems like it's a peaceful time that they're in. They're not concerned about war. They're not concerned about the Roman army. That should be there. To me, that should be there. You know?
Yeah, there should be. I mean, you could argue owing to the sudden and successive calamitous events, yeah, but they're in Rome. The calamitous events, if we're picturing this right, should be happening elsewhere in the Mediterranean in 96, so around the Jerusalem area. But they're in Rome. They're talking about some peaceful existence, and there's only that one small snippet that says something has happened to us. But it could have been a flu epidemic, it could have been earthquakes, it could have been floods. It doesn't have to be brutal persecution. It's just attributed as that. And then, as you say, you read the rest of the letter, there's no indication of strife at all. They're just, the only thing that's the issue is some of the people in your church are disagreeing with who we're putting in charge over you.
Yeah.
And you need to stop that. You need to support your deacons and get behind them. That's the main crux of the letter. And in addition to that, every time they want to make some kind of theological point in support of keeping faith with Jesus to demonstrate what they should do, they go to the Old Testament. They go to the Tanakh, and they quote from Isaiah. They quote from Psalms. Well, hold on. You should have, if you're writing in 96 Common Era, you should have not just the Gospels in front of you, but the passed down hearsay memories of what happened in 30. Why wouldn't you use that as the spiritual examples to give to this church? Why can you only do spiritual examples from the Old Testament?
Right.
And it's the same in the Epistle of Barnabas, exactly the same.
Here's what I think actually happened. I think that this Septuagint got written, and it started getting passed around through Greece slowly over time. Obviously, don't have a printing press, so scribes are writing it. This is a slow process. It ends up in Corinth. It ends up in it ends up in all these different areas. Thessalonica, and so they start reading about this Torah, these Moses and Abraham, and sort of they know they have their Greek, their Homer, Hesiod understanding of the world. And so they don't really understand the Torah that much, but so they're going to obviously interpret it in a certain way. Egypt's going to interpret it a certain way. Syria's going to interpret it a certain way. And what I think happens over time is you get these mystery cults pop up, and they're and so what happens is the Messiah becomes this big question mark. Who is this Messiah? Is he like David? Is he like Joseph? Is he like, who is he going to, what is it? What's the archetype like? So I think these writers start writing up these allegories, and they're borrowing from the Old Testament, and they're even borrowing from other myths, Homer, Osiris, and they're sort of applying this Superman. This is like comic book writing from right now. It's the same thing. It's just a genre had popped up in the first century, whatever, first century BC as well. And there's this new genre, this messianic genre, which is literally the word Christian means. Christian means messianic.
Yeah.
People don't think about that. That's what the word actually means.
Actually, Jesus Christ is actually a label. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I think happens is there's this new Superman idea of who could the Messiah be and what is he going to do. And so they start writing up these gospels, and then boom. And all of a sudden you got this new, like, outside of the temple form of Judaism, but it's very Hellenistic. It's very very Greekized, Romanized. And that's what I think happened. And I think that the concept of the Messiah became literal after, like you said, after the destruction of the temple. And then you even got, like, they're talking about the church being built, but Jerusalem's gone by then. It's called Aelia Capitolona. Yes. So now you have to wonder, is this church the Church of Rome? Are they talking about? Is this even a church at all? Is this a concept of a heavenly church? So that's why I think when you look at it all and take a step back, it's very obvious this is a slow progression over time, and until finally in the 4th century, somebody got Constantine and his bishops said, we're going to actually make this thing a unified version, and we're going to clip off all the edges of the stuff we don't like. And that's what happened. Now we got Now we have what you have called Nicene Christianity, which is abundant today.
Yeah,
that's my theory.
I would 100% agree with that. Yes, and to me, the evidence demonstrates that adequately. That was the course of events. And when you think about it, when we're writing the Gospels, we're in the business of prophecy fulfillment writing. So Mark writes his first. He wasn't necessarily the first one. He's just the first out of the four that have been passed down. But he definitely predates Matthew, Luke, John, and Acts. So when he writes his, he goes straight into Jesus of Nazareth and creates the scene in the death scene in Jerusalem, and it looks like Matthew's come along and said, "Yeah, I like it. It's good. I'm going to do my version, but I get one problem. See, it says Micah 5.1, behold, the Savior will come forth from Bethlehem, and you haven't got any of that. So he adds a birth narrative. The idea of that birth narrative, completely fictitious birth narrative, is just to have somehow Jesus being born in Bethlehem and then transporting him back to Nazareth and then into Jerusalem for the death scene to follow Mark, because he saw that as problematic. We can't have a Messiah that didn't come from Bethlehem. This is prophecy fulfillment. Right. He must have come from Bethlehem. And then comes Luke, and he's of the same opinion, but I don't like your birth narrative. I'm going to put my own birth narrative in for other different reasons. So
he even changed the genealogy. Yeah. They don't even agree on genealogy.
They don't agree in genealogy. And then when you think about it, I couldn't tell you today who my great-grandmother was, or any of them. So apparently he can do a genealogy back, all the way back to David. Yeah, it's just, it beggars belief. It really does. But yes, and they have a different genealogy, yeah.
And actually, Michael Sergu of Princeton pointed out that the genealogies have more philosophical weight than some of the actual story does. Like, you read the genealogy and you read out the names of the people, there's philosophy being injected into the genealogy itself, which is a very red flag for myth here. It's just, you know what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, all of these things which are just ridiculous and couldn't actually have happened. They weren't just sort of plucked out of the sky. They were thought about. We might not know what they actually meant today, but they actually meant something. They represented something. That's why they wrote them down.
Yeah.
I mean, when you go,
who the bloodline is sort of forms who the person is, where he came from, what type of, you know what I mean? And so then that leads to the last question is, could there possibly be a guy named Jesus of Nazareth? And that's, to me, that's like saying there's a Mike in New York City in 1980. Yeah, there was. Yeah. The question is, did he do anything that's written about him in the New Testament? Answer is no, because we could pull those myths out of other areas. We can see from where it's borrowed from the Old Testament. We can see where it's borrowed from other myths. And when you take all that away, you're just left with the skeleton of a guy with the name. That's it.
Yeah. I mean, were there any preachers claiming to be the Messiah back in the day? Well, yeah, we know there were loads. Come follow me, and because they drew crowds, they were seen as a political problem by the authorities, and they were killed. There were loads of them. Was there one called Jesus of Nazareth who stood in front of Pontius Pilate after having emptied the temple on the Passover and being accused of blaspheming God by the Jews? No, that character is 100% fiction. So, and it's the only reason we talk about it today is because of Constantine. And when you really analyze history properly, Constantine was just the lucky winner of a four-way civil war. If Licinius, Maximinus Dio, or Maxentius had won that war, we'd be talking about, was Mithra real or myth today? We wouldn't even know. People would say to you, Jesus who? But we'd be all over Mithra, did he? Yeah.
And to even go further, the Egyptians put Dionysus in their genealogy as a real person, a real king. Or I'm sorry, Osiris. I mean, there was a bunch of Dionysuses. They actually thought he was a historical person too. The Greeks did. The Greeks thought Dionysus was a real person. The Egyptians said Osiris was one of their kings. this happens. This is not the first time this has happened, is what I'm saying.
No, it's old hat. It's human. It seems to be human nature to do it. Yeah, I mean, if you go back far enough with the Greeks, you would have a hard time telling them that Hercules didn't actually exist. And today, we wouldn't even give it a second thought. And it's actually the same now, isn't it, with the patriarchs from the Old Testament? Do we really believe there was an Abraham, a Moses,
who lived for 900 years?
Yeah, the 600-year-old man Noah built a boat with his son.
But he's not a person alive that long. It doesn't show up in the historical record. Come on.
Yeah. But if you went back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, you'd have a hard time finding someone that would, agree that they were mythical. To them, they were real at that time, and that's just over 100 years ago.
And that's the biggest point: is that the belief in the person is what makes him the historical character. Like people thought for 1,000 years, people thought Hercules was a real person until the church era came around. People said he's a myth. Now he's not a historical person. Now everyone laughs at that. But there was a time when no one laughed at that. Now, if tomorrow everybody just said, you know what, this guy's a myth, then that would become the fact forever.
Within a generation,
Yeah, within a generation, right. So
yeah. I mean, I can't remember who said it, but it said if you tell one person a lie and they believe it to be true, it's still a lie. And if that person managed to convince 2,000 people that it was true, it's still a lie. Yeah. Belief in the lie doesn't transform the lie to truth.
That's a good quote to end on right there. Check out Mike Lawrence on Amazon. And any other links that you want to give them?
Yeah, my YouTube channel, I've got, I think, some 8 videos on my research. Notori UK is the YouTube channel.
I just threw a link in the description. Everyone check that out. And you have just attained true gnosis.